Story number 1. The Mirror's Curse, a Bloody Mary tale. When we first heard about Bloody Mary, it was just another campfire story, a spooky dare to pass the time. We were 16, full of teenage bravado and convinced that the world was ours to conquer. It was Emma who first brought it up during our sleepover at Lisa's house. The four of us, Emma, Lisa, Jake, and I, had gathered for a night of cheap horror movies and junk food. But by midnight, the atmosphere had turned restless. "You've heard of Bloody Mary, right?" Emma asked, her eyes gleaming in the dim light of the candles we'd lit for effect. "Of course," Jake scoffed. "Say her name 3 times in the mirror, and she shows up to..." "What? Scratch your face? Pull your hair?" Emma grinned. "Or worse." I rolled my eyes, trying to hide the knot of unease tightening in my stomach. "It's just a stupid urban legend. That's what they all say," Emma teased. "Until they see her." Lisa shifted uncomfortably, her gaze flickering toward the large antique mirror hanging on the wall. "My grandma used to tell me that story. She said a woman named Mary was burned alive in our town back in the 1800s, accused of being a witch after children started disappearing." "That's the story everywhere," Jake said, but his voice had lost its mocking edge. "It's all just folklore." "Well, there's only one way to find out," Emma said, standing up and grabbing a candle. "Let's do it," Lisa protested, but Emma was already dragging the rest of us toward the mirror. The air felt colder as we approached it, though I told myself it was just my imagination. The mirror was old, its ornate gold frame tarnished and flecked with age. It seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, its surface dark and foreboding. Emma handed me the candle, her grin daring me to back out. "Come on, Claire. Be brave." I hesitated, but my pride wouldn't let me chicken out. With a deep breath, I stepped in front of the mirror, the others crowding behind me. The flickering candlelight cast strange shadows across our faces, and I could see my own reflection staring back at me, pale and uncertain. "Bloody Mary," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, nothing happened. I exhaled a shaky laugh, relieved. "See? I told you it's just a..." The candle flickered violently, and the temperature plummeted. Behind me, Lisa let out a small gasp, and I turned to see her staring at the mirror, her face white as a sheet. "What is it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Look," she whispered. I turned back to the mirror, and my blood ran cold. My reflection was still there, but it wasn't me. The figure in the glass was taller, her face gaunt and hollow-eyed, her lips twisted into a cruel smile. Her hands, long and clawed, pressed against the inside of the mirror, as if she were trying to push through. I stumbled back, dropping the candle. The flame snuffed out as it hit the floor, plunging the room into darkness. Jake cursed, fumbling for his phone's flashlight. But when the beam finally cut through the shadows, the mirror was empty, just our pale, terrified faces staring back at us. "We need to get rid of that thing," Lisa whispered. "Let's just leave it alone," Jake said, his voice shaky. "It's over. We're fine." But we weren't fine, not even close. The first sign that something was wrong came the next night. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it, a faint tapping, like fingernails against glass. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound was coming from the mirror on my dresser. I didn't want to look, but some awful, morbid curiosity forced me to. The room was dark, lit only by the glow of the moon through my curtains. But I could see her, the same figure from before, her hollow eyes fixed on me, her hand tapping against the inside of the glass. I bolted out of bed and threw a blanket over the mirror, my hands shaking. The tapping stopped, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. The next day, I called the others. Emma laughed it off, saying I just scared myself. But Lisa admitted she'd been having nightmares. Jake didn't answer his phone. That night, The tapping came again. Louder this time. It wasn't just my mirror, it was the windows, the TV screen, the shiny surface of the kitchen counter. Anywhere I could see my reflection. She was there, her grin growing wider, her fingers drumming a relentless rhythm. By the third day, Jake was missing. His parents said he'd gone out for a walk and never came back. The police found his phone in the woods near his house, but no other trace of him. Emma still refused to believe anything supernatural was happening. But Lisa and I knew better. The shadow in the mirrors was growing stronger, bolder. Lisa called me in the middle of the night, her voice trembling. "She's here. In my house. Get out," I said, already grabbing my keys. "I'm coming over." When I arrived, the house was silent. The front door was unlocked, and I stepped inside, calling Lisa's name. The air was frigid, my breath fogging in the darkness. The mirrors in the hallway were covered with sheets, but I could feel her presence, heavy and suffocating. I found Lisa in her bedroom, standing in front of her vanity mirror. Her eyes were wide and vacant, her hands pressed against the glass. The reflection staring back at her wasn't her own. "Lisa!" I shouted, grabbing her arm, but she didn't respond. Her lips moved silently, as if she were speaking to someone I couldn't see. And then, with a sudden, violent motion, she slammed her head into the mirror. The glass shattered, spraying shards across the room, and she collapsed to the floor. We buried Lisa a week later. The doctors said it was a suicide, but I knew better. She'd been pulled into something far darker than any of us had imagined. Emma moved away, refusing to talk about what had happened. I tried to do the same, but the whispers followed me. Every mirror, every reflective surface was a doorway, place where she could reach me. Last night, I covered every mirror in my apartment, but it didn't help. When I turned off the lights, her voice came from the darkness, soft and mocking. "You called me," she whispered, "and now you're mine. I don't know how much longer I can hold on." The mirrors are starting to crack on their own, splintering as if something is trying to push through. I see her face in my dreams, her grin wider than ever, her fingers clawing at the glass. If you're reading this, take my advice. Don't say her name. Don't look in the mirror. And if you hear the tapping, run. Story number 2. The Winter Curse of Amityville. When we bought the house in Amityville, I thought we were lucky. A 3-story colonial at a price well below market value felt like a gift. I should have known better. A deal like that always comes with strings attached. I'd heard the stories. Of course, everyone has. The DeFeo murders in 1974. The Lutz family fleeing less than a month after moving in, claiming the house was haunted. But I didn't believe in ghosts. I figured the house's grim history was just a convenient excuse for a bad mortgage decision. It was early December when we moved in, just as winter began to dig its claws into New York. My wife, Claire, loved the place from the moment she saw it. With its steep gables and wide porch that overlooked the snow-draped lawn. Our son, Evan, was less enthusiastic. 6 years old, he was still prone to flights of imagination, and the creaky old house unsettled him. "It feels cold," he said, frowning as we unpacked boxes in the living room. I ruffled his hair. "It's just an old house, buddy. Give it time to warm up." But the house didn't warm up. No matter how high we set the thermostat, the air remained chilly, as if the walls exhaled cold. First, we blamed the ancient heating system, but even after a technician confirmed it was working perfectly, the chill persisted. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, a cold that sank into your bones and stayed there. Claire brushed it off. "Old houses are drafty. We'll get used to it." I wasn't so sure. The first night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside. They were faint, but distinct, the crunch of boots on snow, moving slowly around the house. I glanced at the clock. 2:13 a.m. Claire was asleep beside me, her breath soft and even. I slipped out of bed, grabbing the flashlight from the nightstand. and peered through the window. The yard was empty, the snow undisturbed. Still, the sound continued, circling the house in a deliberate, measured pattern. My heart pounded as I crept down the stairs, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I opened the front door, the freezing air hitting me like a slap. The yard stretched out before me, pristine and untouched, but the footsteps didn't stop. They were behind me now, on the porch. I spun around, but there was no one there. The wood beneath my feet creaked, and for a moment, I thought I felt something, a presence, cold and watchful, looming just out of sight. Then the footsteps stopped. The next morning, I didn't tell Claire or Evan about what I'd heard. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the wind or the old wood settling in the cold. But as the days passed, the strange occurrences began to pile up. Evan started waking up at night, screaming about the man in the hallway. Claire insisted it was just nightmares, but the fear in his eyes was real. One night, I found him curled up on the floor of our room, clutching his stuffed bear. He was staring at me, he whispered, his voice trembling. He was smiling. I didn't know how to respond. The hallway outside Evan's room was always empty when I checked, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing day. Shadows seemed to linger in the corners, darker than they should have been. The faint smell of something acrid, like burned wood, began to waft through the house, appearing and disappearing without warning. And then there were the whispers. First, I thought it was the wind. The house was old, after all, and the winter storms could be fierce. But the whispers weren't random. They were low and rhythmic, words just out of reach, rising and falling like a conversation in the next room. Claire dismissed it as pipes groaning or branches scraping against the windows. But I wasn't so sure. One night, as I lay awake in bed, I heard them again. This time, they were closer. I held my breath, straining to hear, and realized they weren't coming from outside, they were in the walls. The voice was deep and raspy, whispering something I couldn't understand. And then, clear as day, said my name. David. I bolted upright, my heart hammering. The room was dark, the only sound Claire's steady breathing. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. The voice had been real, and it had spoken to me. The final straw came on Christmas Eve. We decided to stay in, decorating the tree and drinking hot cocoa by the fire. Evan seemed happier than he had in weeks, his fear forgotten in the glow of the holiday lights. For the first time since we'd moved in, the house felt warm. Then the power went out. The fire died, plunging the room into darkness. The temperature dropped instantly, and Evan whimpered, pressing himself against Claire. I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the basement, muttering curses under my breath. The basement was colder than ever, the air thick with the smell of burned wood. As I approached the breaker box, the beam of my flashlight flickered, and I froze. In the far corner of the room, something moved. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by my flashlight. But as I stared, the shape grew clearer. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its head cocked at an odd angle. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and its mouth twisted into a grin. I stepped forward. I dropped the flashlight and ran, my pulse pounding in my ears. The door to the basement slammed shut behind me, and I threw the bolt, my hands shaking. Claire was in the living room, clutching Evan, her face pale. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We're leaving," I said, my voice firm. "Right now." We drove through the night, the snowstorm making the roads treacherous. I didn't stop until we reached a motel an hour outside of Amityville. Claire didn't ask any questions. She'd felt it too, the weight of the house pressing down on us. The cold that wasn't just cold. The next morning, I called the realtor and put the house back on the market. We never went back. Sometimes, late at night, I dream of the house. I see its windows, dark and empty, staring at me like hollow eyes. I hear the whispers in the walls, the footsteps in the snow, and I see the thing in the basement, this grin wide and hungry. I know it's still there, waiting for the next family to move in, waiting for someone else to call it home. Story number 3. The hunger of the Wendigo. The storm hit harder than we expected. Faster too. By the time we realized we were in trouble, the cabin was no longer visible through the whiteout. The 4 of us, me, Jared, Olivia, and Nate, had planned a weekend getaway in the woods of northern Minnesota, a chance to disconnect from the world and reconnect with each other. Instead, we found ourselves trapped in one of the worst blizzards I'd ever seen, with only the contents of our backpacks to keep us alive. The snow came down in relentless waves, erasing the trail we'd followed earlier that day. The wind howled through the pines, carrying with it a cold so sharp it felt like needles against my skin. Jared, ever the optimist, assured us we'd find the cabin soon. But as the hours dragged on and the sky turned from gray to black, even his confidence began to waver. "We need to stop," Olivia said, her voice tight with panic. "We're going to freeze out here. Stopping means dying." Jared shot back, but there was no heat in his words. We all knew he was scared, even if he wouldn't admit it. Nate, the quietest of our group, pointed to a cluster of trees where the snow wasn't as thick. "Over there," he said. "We can make a shelter for the night." We didn't argue. By then, exhaustion had set in, and every step felt like a battle. The 4 of us huddled together beneath the makeshift cover of pine branches, our breaths fogging the air. The wind still roared, but at least we were out of its direct path. Jared lit a small fire, though it barely warmed us, and we shared what little food we had left, granola bars and trail mix. It wasn't enough. As the night deepened, the cold crept into my bones, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The wind carried strange sounds, low, guttural moans that seemed to come from the forest itself. I told myself it was just the storm, but the unease gnawed at me. Olivia must have felt it too. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes wide. "Hear what?" Jared asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. It sounded like someone crying. We all listened, straining to hear over the wind. And then it came, a faint, keening wail, rising and falling like a sorrowful song. It was distant at first, but as the minutes ticked by, it grew louder, closer. My stomach churned with a fear I couldn't explain. "Maybe it's someone else caught in the storm," Olivia said, though her voice trembled. "No," Nate said firmly. "It's not human." Jared laughed nervously. "Don't start with that crap." But Nate's expression didn't change. He stared into the darkness beyond the firelight, his face pale and drawn. "My grandfather used to tell stories about the Wendigo," he said. "A spirit of hunger and greed. Comes in the winter, when the snow traps you, and the food runs out. It's always hungry, and it always finds you." "Jesus, Nate," Jared snapped. "You think now's the time for campfire stories?" Nate didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the shadows, as though he could see something we couldn't. I wanted to tell him to stop, to say it was just a story, but the wailing grew louder, and deep down, I knew something was out there. We stayed awake as long as we could, the fire burning low as the night dragged on. The sound of the wind seemed to take on a voice, whispering words I couldn't understand. When I finally dozed off, it wasn't sleep so much as surrender. I woke to silence. The storm had stopped, but the air was heavier than before, thick with an unnatural stillness. The fire had burned out, leaving only faint embers glowing in the ash. Jared was gone. At first, I thought he'd wandered off to relieve himself, but as the minutes passed, a sick feeling settled in my gut. I shook Olivia awake, and she sat up groggily, her breath hitching when she saw the empty space where Jared had been. "Nate," I said, shaking him harder than I intended. "Wake up. Jared's missing." He bolted upright, his eyes wide with fear. Without a word, he grabbed the flashlight and stood, scanning the forest around us. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing only endless trees and snow. And then we saw them, footprints. They led away from the camp, deeper into the woods. The strange thing was, they weren't alone. Beside Jared's tracks was another set, larger and clawed, as though some massive animal had followed him. "We have to go after him," Olivia said, her voice shaking. "No," Nate said firmly. "If it's what I think it is, he's already gone." "What the hell does that mean?" I snapped. "We can't just leave him out there." Nate hesitated, his jaw clenched. "If we follow those tracks, it'll come for us too." Olivia and I didn't listen. We grabbed our gear and started down the trail, ignoring Nate's warnings. The footprints led us deeper into the forest, the trees closing in around us like skeletal hands. The air grew colder with each step, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. After what felt like hours, we found him. Jared was kneeling in the snow, his back to us. His clothes were torn, and his skin was pale as frost. I called his name, but he didn't respond. As we got closer, the smell hit me, coppery and rancid, like rotting meat. "Jared," Olivia whispered, her voice breaking. He turned slowly, and my stomach dropped. His eyes were sunken, his lips cracked and bleeding. Blood streaked his face, and his teeth, they were wrong. Too sharp, too many. He smiled, a grotesque parody of the friend we'd known. And I realized he was holding something in his hands, a piece of flesh. "I was so hungry," he said, his voice raw and broken. Olivia screamed, but the sound was cut off as Jared lunged at her, his movements impossibly fast. I froze, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. Nate's voice rang out behind me, shouting something I couldn't understand. Then there was a flash of silver, and Jared crumpled to the ground. Nate stood over him, a hunting knife in his hand, his face pale and grim. "It's not him anymore," he said. "It's the Wendigo." I wanted to argue, to scream that it wasn't true. But as I looked down at Jared's lifeless body, I saw the truth. His hands had twisted into claws, his teeth stained with blood. He wasn't human anymore. We didn't speak as we made our way back to the camp, the weight of what had happened crushing us. The storm returned that night, burying Jared's body in snow, and we left the woods at first light. I never told anyone what happened, and neither did Olivia or Nate. But sometimes, in the dead of winter, I hear the wind howling outside my window, and I swear it sounds like Jared's voice, calling me back. Story number 4. The Haunting of Franklin Mines. Franklin wasn't the kind of town you'd visit unless you had a reason. Nestled in the snowy hills of Pennsylvania, it was a forgotten relic of the coal boom, a place where memories clung like smoke to the walls of abandoned buildings. I'd heard the stories growing up, whispered over campfires and passed down like folklore. The mine collapse in 1907, the screams that echoed through the tunnels, and the ghosts that still walked its streets. I didn't believe any of it, of course. But when my editor assigned me to write a piece about haunted places in rural America, Franklin was at the top of my list. 100 men dead in one of the worst mining disasters in the state's history. It practically wrote itself. I figured I'd spend a couple of nights, interview the locals, maybe take some pictures of the old mine shaft, and leave with a spooky Halloween story. I should have known better. The drive into Franklin was like slipping into another world. The snow began to fall as I turned off the highway, thick flakes that blanketed the trees and muffled the sound of my tires on the road. By the time I reached the town square, it was dark, and the old streetlights cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets. Most of the buildings were boarded up, their windows dark, but a single neon sign flickered in the window of a diner. I pulled into the empty parking lot, my headlights slicing through the swirling snow. The diner smelled like grease and coffee, and the only other occupant was an elderly man sitting at the counter. He looked up as I entered, his eyes narrowing. "You lost?" he asked, his voice rough with disuse. "Not exactly," I said, sliding onto a stool. "I'm a journalist, writing a story about the mine." The man's expression didn't change. Ain't much to say that hasn't already been said. I'm looking for local accounts. People who've experienced unusual things. His eyes flickered toward the window, where the snow was coming down harder now. For a moment, he didn't say anything, and I thought he was going to dismiss me. Then he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You ever hear the wind scream? I blinked. What? The wind, he said. When it blows through the old mine shaft in winter, it don't sound right, like it's carrying the voices of those poor bastards who died down there. They say you can hear 'em crying, begging to be let out. I shivered, though the diner was warm. Have you heard it? He didn't answer, just turned back to his coffee. I finished my meal in silence, paid my bill, and asked for directions to the mine. The man gave them reluctantly, his face lined with worry. Don't stay too long, he said. And if you hear the wind scream, you get out. You understand me? I nodded, though I didn't take him seriously. Ghost stories didn't scare me. They should have. The mine was less than a mile outside of town, hidden behind a row of skeletal trees. My car crunched to a stop on the gravel road, and I stepped out into the freezing air. The shaft loomed before me, a gaping black maw in the earth, framed by crumbling stone. Rusted equipment lay scattered around the site, half buried in snow. A metal sign hung crookedly from one of the beams, its faded letters reading, Franklin Coal Company, closed 1907. I pulled out my flashlight and camera, snapping a few photos of the entrance. The air was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. I ventured closer, the beam of my flashlight bouncing off the jagged walls of the shaft. The ground beneath me felt unsteady, as if the earth remembered the collapse and was waiting to take another victim. And then I heard it. First, I thought it was the wind, a low, mournful howl that rose and fell like a dirge. But as I stood there, straining to hear, I realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was a voice. No, not a voice. Voices. They echoed from deep within the shaft, overlapping and discordant, like 100 people whispering at once. My heart pounded as I stepped back, my breath fogging in the cold air. The voices grew louder, more insistent, and I swore I could make out words. Help us. Let us out. Please. I stumbled away from the shaft, nearly dropping my flashlight. The whispers followed me, carried on the cold wind, until I reached my car and slammed the door shut. I sat there, shaking, the engine idling as the snow continued to fall. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the wind and the cold. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I stayed at the town's only motel, a rundown place with flickering lights and paper-thin walls. I barely slept, haunted by the sound of those voices. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of the mine. I was trapped in the shaft, the walls closing in around me, the air thick with dust and despair. The voices were all around me, screaming now, their cries of pain and terror echoing in the dark. I woke drenched in sweat, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was freezing, and the window was open, though I didn't remember leaving it that way. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers. The next morning, I returned to the mine, determined to prove to myself that it was nothing more than a creepy old ruin. But the moment I stepped onto the site, the air grew heavy, and the whispers began again. This time, they were louder, clearer. I could hear my name. Laura. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The voices were coming from the shaft, rising in a chorus of anguish and fury. And then I saw them. Figures emerged from the darkness, pale and translucent, their eyes hollow sockets that burned with a cold light. Their faces were twisted with pain, their mouths open in silent screams. They reached for me, their skeletal hands clawing at the air. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car, the whispers chasing me every step of the way. As I sped back to town, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them standing at the edge of the woods, their hollow eyes watching me. I left Franklin that same day, my article unfinished. I told my editor I'd seen nothing unusual. But the truth is, I'll never forget what happened at that mine. The voices still haunt me, their cries echoing in my dreams. And every winter, when the wind howls through the trees, I hear it again, the screams of the dead, calling me back. Story number 5. The Curse of Donner Camp. We arrived at Donner Lake just before sunset. The sky a muted palette of grays and purples. The air was biting, heavy with the promise of snow, and the skeletal trees lining the lake cast long shadows across the frozen ground. I had no idea why Mark insisted on coming here, especially in the dead of winter, but his obsession with the Donner Party and its grisly history had reached a fever pitch. For weeks, he'd talked about the haunting aura of the place, about how the whispers of the past could still be felt in the biting wind. I wasn't so sure. History was history, tragic, yes, but not supernatural. Yet, as we stood by the edge of the lake, staring out at the endless expanse of snow, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Mark's enthusiasm was undeterred by the creeping cold. He dropped his backpack onto the snow and began unpacking our gear. "This is it," he said, his breath visible in the frigid air. "This is where it all happened, where they ate each other." I shivered, though not from the cold. "Yeah, I know. You've only told me 100 times." He shot me a grin. "Come on, Laura. Don't tell me you're not at least a little curious. People say this place is cursed, that the spirits of the Donner Party still wander the woods. People say a lot of things," I muttered, but the unease in my stomach didn't fade. We set up camp near a cluster of pine trees, their twisted branches swaying in the wind. Mark had insisted on staying overnight, claiming it would give him a better sense of the place. I thought he was crazy, but I'd come along anyway, partly out of morbid curiosity and partly because I didn't trust him not to get himself killed out here. As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted, and the world outside our tent was swallowed by the kind of silence that feels alive. It started with the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, soft, low murmurs threading through the trees, but as I lay in my sleeping bag, straining to hear over Mark's snores, I realized the sound was too deliberate, too human. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I sat up, my breath fogging in the frigid air. "Mark," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. He grumbled something incoherent and rolled over. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, though I couldn't make out the words. They seemed to be coming from outside the tent. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the door, the icy air biting at my face. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but snow and trees. The whispers stopped. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. Then I saw them. Shapes moved between the trees, pale and flickering, like flames caught in a snowstorm. My breath caught as one of the figures turned toward me. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a hollow void, black and endless. It tilted its head as if regarding me. And then it spoke. "Why have you come?" The voice wasn't loud, but it carried, echoing in my ears even as the figure melted back into the shadows. I stumbled back into the tent, my hands shaking as I zipped the door shut. Mark woke with a start, his eyes groggy and annoyed. "What the hell, Laura? There's something out there," I stammered. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. "It's probably just the wind or an animal. You're freaking yourself out." But I wasn't imagining things. I knew what I'd seen. The whispers returned in the early hours of the morning. Louder this time. Mark heard them too, his face pale as he sat beside me in the tent. "Okay," he admitted. "That's not the wind." We decided to leave at first light, but the night had other plans. As we packed our things, the temperature seemed to drop even further, and the wind picked up, howling like a living thing. The whispers became screams, distant at first, but drawing closer. Shadows danced outside the tent, flickering against the canvas like firelight. "Do you hear that?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. I nodded, too terrified to speak. The screams grew louder, interspersed with guttural cries and wet, tearing sounds. It sounded like a slaughter. We burst out of the tent, desperate to escape. But the moment we stepped into the open, we froze. The snow was stained red, and scattered around us were fragments of bones. Gnawed clean. The shadows weren't shadows anymore. They were people, or what was left of them. Their faces were sunken, their eyes empty sockets, their mouths stretched into grotesque grins. They moved toward us with jerky, unnatural motions, their skeletal hands outstretched. Mark grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the lake. Run! We stumbled through the snow, the figures closing in. Their laughter echoed around us, high and hollow, like the sound of dry branches snapping in the wind. I tripped, falling hard onto the frozen ground. One of the figures loomed over me, its eyeless gaze boring into mine. Its mouth opened, and I smelled rot and decay. Stay. It whispered. Join us. Mark yanked me to my feet, and we ran. The lake stretched out before us, its surface frozen solid. We didn't stop until we were halfway across, the ice cracking beneath our boots. The figures stopped at the edge, their grins fading as they stared after us. And then they vanished. We didn't speak as we made our way back to the car. The sun rose, painting the snow in soft pinks and golds. But the beauty of the scene was lost on me. All I could see were those empty faces, those hollow eyes. Mark tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just our imaginations. But I knew better. Something was wrong with that place. Something ancient and angry. I could still hear the whispers, faint and far away, as we drove down the mountain. That night, I dreamed of the camp. The shadows were waiting for me, their grins wide and terrible. And when I woke, my hands were covered in blood. Story number 6. The Gatekeeper of Hauska Castle. The snow was falling thick as we arrived at Hauska Castle, the wind howling like a wounded animal. Mark had dragged me here, convinced that the rumors of the so-called gateway to hell were worth investigating. The castle was a grim silhouette against the leaden sky, its ancient walls wrapped in a shroud of foreboding. There were no outward-facing windows, a fact that unsettled me the moment I noticed it. Something about the structure screamed that it wasn't meant to defend from outside threats. It was meant to trap something within. The caretaker, a gaunt old man named Pavel, met us at the gate. His voice was a low rasp as he welcomed us, though there was no warmth in his words. He led us through the arched entrance, into the bone-chilling cold of the interior. The air was heavy, oppressive, and carried a faint metallic tang that I couldn't place. Pavel recited the castle's history with a mechanical detachment. Beneath the castle, he said, lay a pit that had no bottom. It was discovered centuries ago, and strange noises began to emerge from its depths. Moaning, screaming, the flapping of wings too large to belong to any bird. The pit was sealed with thick stone slabs, and the castle was built to act as a prison for whatever lay beneath. Mark, always the skeptic, snorted under his breath. But I couldn't shake the weight of Pavel's words. The pit wasn't just a story. It felt like a presence, something alive and listening. Pavel's gaze lingered on me as he finished speaking, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in his sunken eyes. He handed us a heavy iron key and told us that we were free to explore. But under no circumstances were we to descend to the lower levels. Mark, of course, grinned at that. Forbidden zones were his specialty. The first few hours passed uneventfully as we explored the castle's upper halls. It was a strange, disorienting place, with corridors that seemed to twist in on themselves and rooms that led nowhere. The architecture was unsettling, devoid of logic, as though it had been designed by someone with no regard for human habitation. The cold seeped into my bones, and even Mark's enthusiasm began to wane as the daylight faded. We decided to set up camp in one of the larger rooms, where a crumbling fireplace offered the illusion of comfort. That night, the noises began. At first, it was just the wind, a low whistle that echoed through the stone halls. But as the hours dragged on, the sound shifted, becoming something else entirely. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, a murmur, like voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I sat up, straining to hear over the crackling of the dying fire. The sound seemed to rise from beneath us, from somewhere deep within the castle. My pulse quickened as the murmur grew louder, taking on a rhythmic cadence. It wasn't random. It was chanting. I shook Mark awake, but he waved me off, muttering something about overactive imaginations. Frustrated, I grabbed my flashlight and decided to investigate. The sound guided me, pulling me toward a staircase at the far end of the hall. The air grew colder as I descended, the stone steps slick with condensation. The chanting grew louder, reverberating through the narrow passage. My heart pounded as I reached the bottom, where a massive iron door stood ajar. It wasn't supposed to be open. Beyond the door lay a cavernous chamber, its walls etched with strange, jagged symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the beam of my flashlight. And in the center of the room was the pit. It was a jagged, gaping hole in the earth, its edges lined with ancient carvings. The chanting was deafening now, a chorus of voices that seemed to rise from the pit itself. I stepped closer, my breath catching as I peered into the darkness. There was no bottom, only an abyss that swallowed the light and gave nothing back. Something moved in the pit. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the shadows. But then I saw it again, a ripple, a shifting mass that defied explanation. The air grew thick, suffocating. As the chanting reached a fever pitch, I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering wildly. The shadows along the walls seemed to come alive, twisting and stretching toward me. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing like gunshots as I climbed the stairs 2 at a time. The chanting followed me, a relentless tide of sound that gnawed at my sanity. When I burst back into our room, Mark was sitting upright, his face pale. He didn't need to ask where I'd been. He'd heard it too. The chanting stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that was almost worse. We sat in the flickering firelight, neither of us daring to speak. Somewhere in the castle, a door slammed shut, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. We stayed awake until dawn, every creak and groan of the ancient building setting our nerves on edge. By morning, Pavel was gone. We searched the castle, calling his name, but there was no trace of him. The only sign he'd ever been there was the iron key, now lying on the table where we'd last seen him. Mark was unusually quiet as we packed our things, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we made our way to the entrance, I glanced back and froze. There, at the far end of the hall, stood a figure cloaked in shadow. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and its head tilted unnaturally as it watched us. I grabbed Mark's arm and pulled him toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. We didn't stop until we were outside, the icy wind cutting into us like knives. The castle loomed behind us, its blank windows like hollow eyes. Mark refused to talk about what we'd seen, and I didn't press him. Some things are better left unspoken. The dreams started that night. I was back in the chamber, the pit yawning before me. The chanting filled my ears, and the shadows reached for me with fingers like smoke. Every time I woke, the symbols from the walls were burned into my vision, seared into my mind. They follow me still, those whispers, those shapes in the dark. And somewhere, deep beneath Hauska Castle, something stirs, something that knows my name. Story number 7. The Curse of Dyatlov Pass. I never thought I'd return to the Ural Mountains. The air was colder than I remembered, biting through my parka as I stepped off the creaking snowmobile. My guide, an old man named Eerie, said nothing as he unpacked our gear. He didn't need to. The silence of Dyatlov Pass spoke louder than words. It had been 65 years since 9 mountaineers had met their bizarre, inexplicable deaths here. Theories ranged from hypothermia to military experiments to alien intervention. But the locals knew better. They whispered of an ancient curse, a punishment for trespassing on sacred ground. I came here to uncover the truth, or so I told myself. In reality, I had no idea what I was looking for, but something about this place called to me, a dark gravity I couldn't resist. The first night was uneventful. Yuri and I pitched our tent near the tree line, just as the Dyatlov group had done all those years ago. The wind howled like a feral beast, but our fire held strong. Over vodka and smoked fish, Yuri shared the legends of the Mansi people, the indigenous tribe who considered this land holy. They call it Koletsyakal, he said. Mountain of the Dead. I laughed nervously. Comforting name. Yuri's expression darkened. It's not a joke. They say the spirits of their ancestors roam here, protecting the mountain. If you anger them, he trailed off, staring into the flames. What happens? I pressed. He didn't answer. By the second day, the unease had set in. The weather turned vicious, with snow falling in dense, suffocating sheets. Our progress slowed to a crawl as we trudged higher into the pass. My GPS glitched, the screen flickering between coordinates that made no sense. Yuri cursed under his breath, muttering prayers in Russian. Are you okay? I asked. He shook his head. We should not be here. That night, I heard it for the first time. First, sounded like the wind, a low, mournful whistle that ebbed and flowed. But as I lay in my sleeping bag, straining to hear over Yuri's snores, the sound became sharper, more distinct. It was a voice. No, not a voice. Voices. They chanted in a language I didn't understand. Guttural and rhythmic. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I reached for my flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. The air in the tent grew icy, colder than the blizzard outside. Then the whispers stopped. Something scratched against the tent fabric. Slow and deliberate, my heart pounded as I fumbled for the zipper, my breath fogging in the frigid air. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, there was nothing, just endless snow and darkness. By morning, Yuri was gone. His sleeping bag was empty, his boots and jacket missing. I found his tracks leading away from the tent, but they disappeared after 20 feet. Swallowed by the snow, panic set in. I screamed his name until my throat was raw, but the mountains swallowed my voice. My radio was dead. My compass spun wildly. Useless. I was alone. Desperation drove me to keep moving. I packed what little gear I could carry and set off in the direction I thought would lead me back to civilization. The storm had eased, but the cold was relentless, gnawing at my fingers and toes. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time lost all meaning in the endless white. And then I saw them. 9 figures stood in a line on the ridge ahead, their silhouettes stark against the gray sky. My breath caught in my throat. Yuri, I called. The figures didn't move. I approached cautiously, my boots crunching in the snow. As I drew closer, I realized something was wrong, terribly wrong. Their skin was as pale as the snow, their eyes black voids that seemed to swallow the light. Frost clung to their hair and clothes, and their mouths hung open in silent screams. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. These were the Dyatlov hikers, their bodies frozen in the exact positions they had been found decades ago. But they were standing, and they were looking at me. I ran. Blind panic propelled me through the snow, my legs burning with exhaustion. The voices returned, louder now, screaming in my ears. The ground seemed to shift beneath me, the snow swallowing my feet with every step. I tripped and fell, tumbling down a slope. When I came to a stop, I was face to face with a skeleton, half buried in the ice. Its bony fingers clutched a rusted hunting knife, and its skull was caved in, as if struck by something heavy. The whispers grew deafening. I scrambled to my feet, but the ground beneath me gave way. I fell into darkness, the icy walls of a cavern closing around me. When I woke, I was lying on a stone altar, surrounded by ancient carvings that glowed with an eerie blue light. The air was thick with the stench of decay. Figures emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by ceremonial masks. They chanted in the same guttural language I had heard in the tent, their voices rising in a crescendo. I tried to move, but my limbs were frozen, paralyzed by some unseen force. One of the figures stepped forward, holding a blade carved from black obsidian. His eyes met mine, and I felt a wave of despair so profound it stole my breath. "You should not have come here," it whispered in perfect English. The blade descended. I woke up in a hospital in Ekaterinburg, my body covered in frostbite and bruises. A rescue team had found me at the edge of the pass, unconscious and half-buried in snow. No trace of Eerie was ever found. I've tried to convince myself it was a hallucination, a nightmare born of hypothermia and fear, but every night, I see their faces, the hikers, the spirits. They're waiting for me to return, and someday, I know I will. Story number 8. The Curse of Cheka's Hollow. When the frost clawed at my window in a drafty Moscow apartment, Dmitri first told me the story of Cheka's Hollow. His voice was low, almost conspiratorial, as if the mere mention of the name could summon something ancient and malevolent. "It's a dead village," he said, cradling his vodka. "Empty cabins, rotting roofs, but the air there, it's wrong." I leaned forward. Dmitri was a seasoned guide, a man who had seen the bleakest corners of Siberia, yet his usually calm demeanor was shaken. "They say the curse started after the shaman appeared," he continued. "A wizened old man, eyes like embers, when the loggers destroyed the forest. He warned them. They didn't listen." "And what happened?" I asked. Dmitri's gaze dropped to the table. "Death. Slow, creeping death. No one lives there now. The land won't allow it." As an investigative journalist, I had a weakness for stories like this. Dmitri's words weren't a warning. They were an invitation. 2 weeks later, I stood at the edge of Cheka's Hollow. The journey had been brutal. Siberia's winter was an unforgiving adversary, and the closer we came to the village, the heavier the air felt. Dmitri had refused to accompany me, muttering prayers as he handed over a map. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a snowy forest, but an oppressive stillness. No birds, no wind. Even the crunch of my boots on the snow felt muffled. The village appeared suddenly, its broken cabins leaning against the white landscape like forgotten tombstones. The ground was littered with remnants of life, rusted tools, tattered clothes, a child's doll half-buried in the snow. I chose the largest cabin as my base. The door creaked on its hinges, revealing a room coated in dust and decay. A table stood in the center, its surface scarred by knife marks. On one wall, a crude map of the forest was pinned, annotated with faded Cyrillic. Then I saw the diary. The diary belonged to Sergei Ivanov, the foreman of the logging camp. The entries began innocuously enough. Descriptions of the crew, the weather, the challenges of their work. But as I read further, the tone shifted. April 3rd. The old man came again. He says the spirits are angry, that we're taking more than the forest can give. I told him to leave, but his words linger. Even the men are uneasy. April 10th. Kolya didn't show up for work today. We found him near the old oak, hanging, his eyes black as coal. The men are terrified. April 15th. The whispers start at night. We've checked the woods, but there's no one there. I told the men to ignore it, but I can feel it too. Something's watching us. The final entry was scrawled hastily. The ink smudged. April 20th, we're leaving. Those who can. The forest doesn't want us here. The shaman warned us, and we didn't listen. I hear them now. They're coming. A chill ran down my spine. I closed the diary and glanced at the door, half expecting Sergei's specter to burst through. But the room remained still, too still. That night, I understood what Sergei meant. It began with a whisper, faint, like the rustle of leaves. I thought it was the wind, but there was no wind. The whispers grew louder, intertwining like a discordant chant. The hairs on my neck stood on end as I strained to catch the words. but they were in no language I recognized. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the room. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls. Flickering in the beam of light, the whispers ceased abruptly, replaced by an overwhelming silence. My breath was the only sound, ragged and shallow. Then, the door creaked open. I froze. Standing in the doorway was a figure cloaked in darkness. His form was indistinct, shifting as if it were made of smoke. But its eyes, they burned like embers, piercing and malevolent. "You shouldn't be here," it rasped. The voice was layered, as though multiple entities spoke at once. Panic overtook me. I stumbled backward, knocking over the table. The diary slid to the floor, its pages fluttering open. The figure stepped forward, the skeletal hand outstretched. I bolted through the back door, the cold night air biting my skin. The forest was a maze of shadows, each tree a potential threat. The whispers followed me, growing louder with each step. My flashlight flickered, then died, plunging me into darkness. I ran blindly, branches clawing at my face and arms. Somehow, I found myself at the edge of the village. The whispers stopped as suddenly as they had begun. Gasping for breath, I turned to look back. The figure stood at the village's boundary, its fiery eyes watching. Then it vanished. I returned to Moscow the next day, shaken and frostbitten. Dmitri was waiting for me. He took one look at my face and nodded knowingly. "You saw it," he said. "What is it?" I whispered. "The forest's vengeance," he replied. "The shaman's curse. You're lucky to be alive." For weeks, I tried to rationalize what I had experienced. Hallucinations brought on by cold and exhaustion. The power of suggestion. But the whispers lingered in my mind, replaying in the quiet hours of the night. And then, the dreams began. In my dreams, I am back in Cheka's hollow. The figure stands at the edge of the forest, its eyes burning brighter with each passing night. The whispers return, louder and clearer, until I finally understand their words. The forest remembers. I wake drenched in sweat, my heart racing, but the feeling doesn't fade. Every winter, when the nights are longest, I hear the whispers again. They grow louder, closer. I know one day they will come for me,